Racist flight attendant harasses Latina mum freezes when she calls governor. Welcome, dear viewers, to a tale that unravels at 30,000 feet in the sky, a tale brimming with courage, injustice, and a twist no one could see coming. In this dramatic narrative, we follow Luciana Rodriguez, a devoted Latina mother on a mission of love, only to find herself targeted by a seemingly untouchable flight attendant. With tensions rising and old resentments exposed, the cabin becomes a battleground for dignity and respect. What begins as a routine flight soon spirals into uncharted territory when Luciana dares to take a stand. Fasten your seatbelts and prepare for a shocking, unpredictable journey. Before we dive in, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. If you're excited about this story, let us know. If you enjoyed the video, press 1. If not, press O. Your feedback really inspires me to gather more uplifting and meaningful stories. Luciana Rodriguez was not the type of person to court drama. A single mother from a small neighborhood in San Antonio, she prided herself on staying calm in the face of adversity. She had endured her share of life's injustices, scraping by as a waitress, dealing with disapproving glances whenever she spoke Spanish in public, and holding her head high while her young daughter, Inez, watched her hustle to make ends meet. Yet nothing had prepared her for the storm she was about to face at 30,000 feet aboard a sleek Boeing 737 bound for Los Angeles. On that humid morning, Luciana had roused Inez before dawn. They had a special trip, planned one that involved meeting Luciana's aging mother in California for a long overdue family reunion. The anticipation glimmered in the little girl's eyes, and Luciana matched that excitement with a hopeful smile. She believed that for once things were coming together. She had saved enough money for 2 round-trip tickets on Asturian Air, arranged a few days off from her hectic job, and left San Antonio with a hopeful spirit. What she didn't know was that the seat she had been assigned near the front of the plane would put her directly under the watchful gaze of a flight attendant named Helen, a woman whose prejudice simmered behind a polished uniform and a forced, professional smile. A slight chill crept up Luciana's spine as soon as she stepped onto the jet bridge, her carry-on clutched tight in one hand, Inez's small fingers entwined in the other. The crisp, cool air blasting through the cabin contrasted sharply with the Texas heat she'd left behind. At first, she felt only relief she welcomed the chance to finally relax in a climate-controlled environment. But that relief was short-lived when she glimpsed Helen, the senior flight attendant, scrutinizing her from a distance. Helen stood in the galley area with a posture so rigid it looked as if her spine had been carved from ice. Her blonde hair was pinned into a flawless chignon, her uniform meticulously pressed. She offered polite nods to passengers, but her eyes lingered on Luciana and Inez for a beat too long. It wasn't a look of curiosity or even mild interest. It was the kind of searching gaze that stripped people of their anonymity and laid bare every assumption in the observer's mind. Before Luciana had time to second-guess the sour feeling in her stomach, Helen's rigid smile stiffened into something even more forced. Then, without a word, Helen jerked her head slightly in disapproval, as if silently judging Luciana's entire existence. Luciana's heart fluttered with an unspoken worry, though she told herself she was imagining things. She guided Inez to their seats, hoping that once they were settled, the apprehension would disappear. Luciana found their row seats 6A and 6B just behind the plush first-class section. She was relieved to have snagged the seats during a limited time sale a month earlier. The tall cabin windows greeted them, revealing a bustling tarmac where baggage handlers scurried and planes roared. Inez pressed her nose to the glass, entranced by the enormous wings and the neon-vested crew outside. As Luciana stowed her carry-on, Helen reappeared. "Ma'am, you and your daughter need to step aside," she said, her tone cold. "That overhead bin is reserved for first-class passengers only." Surprised, Luciana glanced around. The bin above her seat was neither sealed off nor marked differently from any other overhead compartment. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize," she began softly. "But this is where our seats—" I said, "Step aside, ma'am," Helen cut in, offering no explanation. A short, clipped gesture of her hand underscored that the conversation was over. A hush descended on the neighboring passengers. Some eyes shifted away uncomfortably, while others watched with sympathy or curiosity. Luciana felt her face grow hot as she removed her carry-on from the bin. It was a small annoyance, but Helen's tone, combined with the way she refused to look directly at Luciana, made it feel like more than a simple airline regulation. Luciana and Inez squeezed into their seats, each silently wondering if this was just the beginning of something far worse. Minutes later, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair approached seat 6C, the aisle seat next to Luciana and her daughter. He smiled kindly at Inez before settling in, placing his laptop bag beneath the seat. Luciana tried to force a polite smile, her mind still churned with the discomfort of Helen's curt orders. "Excited for the trip?" the man asked, in a casual attempt at friendly conversation. "Trying to be," Luciana replied quietly, glancing toward the front of the plane. She could see Helen talking with the other flight attendants, occasionally flicking her gaze toward Luciana and Inez. "We're off to visit my mother in L.A., he nodded with understanding. "Family can make it worth the hassle. I'm Tom, by the way." "Luciana," she replied, her voice still tinged with anxiety. "And this is my daughter, Inez." For a few moments, their conversation eased the tension in the air. Tom cracked a joke about how airports always seem to lose his luggage, and Inez giggled despite her tiredness. But the sense of unease lingered. Helen's presence loomed over Luciana like a storm cloud, always on the verge of thundering. In the back of Luciana's mind, a small voice whispered that the flight attendant's first remarks were only the tip of the iceberg. While the remaining passengers boarded, Helen made her way down the aisle, instructing people to buckle up for takeoff. She checked each row with mechanical efficiency. When she reached row 6, her demeanor changed. She all but ignored Tom, focusing squarely on Luciana and Inez. "Is your daughter strapped in properly?" she demanded. Her voice was loud enough that heads turned. Luciana, startled, responded calmly, "Yes, I made sure." Helen leaned in, eyes narrowing. "I need to see for myself." Without warning, she tugged on Inez's seatbelt so firmly that Inez let out a startled yelp. Luciana felt her blood surge hot in her veins. "Careful," Luciana said, her voice taut. "She's just a child." Helen curled her lip, as if the slightest pushback was an affront to her authority. "I'm just following protocol," she declared, and marched off. Luciana's thoughts spiraled with questions. Why was Helen singling them out? Was it because of her accent, her dark hair and eyes, or the faint Spanish lullabies she'd been whispering to Inez while they waited? She had heard horror stories about subtle and sometimes overt discrimination in public spaces, but she never imagined it would be this blatant, and certainly not on a plane, where safety and courtesy were supposed to be top priorities. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Luciana tried to gather her composure. Maybe Helen was having a bad day, she reasoned. Maybe there was a personal issue or some high-level stress that had nothing to do with Luciana's background. Yet the signs were hard to ignore. The roar of the engines drowned out the uneasy hush inside the cabin. Inez clutched Luciana's hand, her small face pressed against the window. She seemed more enthralled by the plane's takeoff than troubled by Helen's behavior. Luciana was determined to protect that sense of wonder. When the Boeing 737 lifted off the runway, Tom gave them a thumbs up, congratulating Inez on her first big adventure of the day. For a few minutes, the turbulence of ascending overshadowed any thoughts of the rude flight attendant. Clouds enveloped them, and the world below shrank. If Luciana focused just on the sensation of flight, she could almost forget the tension. However, once the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign clicked off, Helen's voice rang out through the intercom, announcing beverage service. Luciana couldn't help but feel a coil of dread tighten in her stomach. She feared that this was only the beginning of Helen's scrutiny and hostility. She was right. Helen and another flight attendant, a younger woman named Brooke, began wheeling the beverage cart down the narrow aisle. Brooke offered cheerful smiles, asking each passenger politely what they would like. In stark contrast, Helen's features remained locked in a stern expression. Each time she passed Luciana and Inez, her jaw tightened, as though she was forcing her words through a clenched barrier. When the cart reached row 6, Brooke immediately turned to Luciana. "Can I get you something to drink? Juice, soda, water?" Luciana asked for 2 apple juices, one for herself and one for Inez. As Brooke handed her the drinks, Helen suddenly interjected, "You do understand English, right? I asked if anyone in this row wanted the premium snack box. It costs extra." Tom's eyes widened. Even Brooke looked uncomfortable. Luciana swallowed her anger. "We're fine, thank you," she managed in a steady voice, refusing to rise to the bait. Helen stared down at them for a long moment, then silently shoved a pile of napkins into Luciana's lap, as if she might spill her drink at any moment. Luciana's pulse hammered in her temples. She could see the tension mounting, not just in her own body but in the nervous glances of passengers around them. The flight was only an hour into its journey, and it already felt like an eternity. Somewhere deep inside, Luciana braced for a confrontation she had never wanted. After the beverage service passed, Luciana noticed a disconcerting pattern. Helen would check on every row for seatbelt compliance or trash collection, but she always paused an extra beat at Luciana's row, scanning her and Inez as though they were intruders. Once, Helen even asked to see their boarding passes again, claiming it was part of a routine check. Tom, who had also been asked to show his pass, gave Luciana a shrug and a sympathetic glance. But Luciana knew that this repeated interrogation was anything but routine. At one point, Inez asked in Spanish, "Mami, ¿por qué está tan enojada esa señora?" "Mommy, why is that lady so angry?" Luciana hushed her gently, worried that Helen might overhear and find another reason to harass them. Still, the rising frustration couldn't be completely suppressed. Each time Helen glided back toward their row, Luciana felt her body tense, preparing for the next jab. In those brief, fleeting moments of peace between Helen's visits, she mentally played out different scenarios. Should she confront Helen? Should she speak to another flight attendant? Or should she simply endure it until they landed? Little did Luciana realize how drastically the situation would escalate well beyond rude remarks and humiliating instructions. Halfway through the flight, an unexpected announcement jarred everyone from their uneasy calm. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. We're anticipating some turbulence over the desert region, so I'm going to leave the seatbelt sign on for a bit. Flight attendants, please secure the cabin." Helen briskly made her way down the aisle, instructing passengers to keep their belts fastened. Luciana noticed that she was no longer with Brooke. It appeared Helen had volunteered to handle this section of the cabin alone. By then, Luciana suspected Helen had singled her out deliberately. When Helen reached their row, she frowned at Inez, who had been stretching her legs in her seat. "Young lady," Helen barked, "sit back properly. We're about to hit rough air." Inez shrank against Luciana. The plane gave a mild shudder, but Luciana's anger flared. "She's fine," she said, forcing civility into her tone. "Her seatbelt is on." Helen regarded Luciana with an almost feral intensity. "And you, are you buckled up?" Luciana nodded, even though the belt around her waist was clearly visible. Helen lingered, as if she wanted to say more, then a flicker of turbulence rattled the overhead compartments, and Helen moved on. But Luciana sensed that something inside Helen had snapped, and it was only a matter of time before it boiled over in front of everyone. The turbulence grew worse. Overhead bins shook, and the plane lurched, eliciting gasps and startled cries from various rows. Luciana found herself gripping the armrest. Inez's eyes went wide with fear, and Luciana placed a calming hand on her daughter's shoulder, reminding her to breathe and stay calm. Suddenly, a jolt caused a passenger's drink a few rows ahead to spill onto the aisle. Helen appeared instantly, her face contorted with frustration. With the seatbelt sign still glaring overhead, she had to lean precariously to collect the trash. Passengers tried to stay out of her way, yet her frustration was palpable, her mouth twisted, and her eyes flashed with barely contained contempt. As she mopped up the spilled drink, the plane lurched again, and Helen nearly lost her balance. She grabbed onto the seat next to her, coincidentally Luciana's seat, and whipped around in anger, as though blaming Luciana for her near tumble. Without warning, Helen spat. "You people never follow instructions, always making things worse for everyone else." For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Luciana froze, stunned by the venom in Helen's words. A silence fell across the rows surrounding them, so profound that Luciana could hear Inez's shaky breathing. Tom stared at Helen, appalled. Luciana felt her heart slam into her ribs, a storm of indignation brewing inside her. This was no longer mere rudeness, it was something far more ugly. The silence broke with a single voice. Tom, in an uncharacteristically firm tone, said, "That's enough. She hasn't done a thing to you." Helen turned her gaze on Tom, her lip curling. "You have no idea what's going on here, sir," she retorted, her words dripping with condescension. "I'm responsible for the safety of every passenger on this plane, including those who can't follow the simplest rules." Luciana felt her cheeks burn. She had dealt with snide remarks before, but never in such a public and humiliating way. Part of her wanted to shrink back and avoid confrontation. Another part of her roared to speak up. She opened her mouth to defend herself, her accent trembling at the edges of her carefully chosen words, but before she could utter a syllable, a piercing announcement from the cockpit demanded that all passengers remain seated with seatbelts fastened due to the turbulence. Helen clenched her jaw and stormed back toward the galley. The hush that followed was thick with tension. Several nearby passengers gave Luciana encouraging nods or concerned glances, but no one dared break the silence. Luciana leaned close to Inez, whispering reassurance. Inside, her resolve hardened. She would not let this pass without consequences. She owed it to her daughter to stand up for what was right. As the turbulence finally subsided, Luciana's mind was a torrent of conflict and decision. She could wait until they landed and file a complaint with Attendant, but part of her worried that it would be swept under the rug. She considered pressing the call button to speak with another flight attendant, but she suspected Helen might intercept the request. Then a faint memory flashed in her mind. A friend of hers, Yadira, had once been in a similar situation on a different airline and ended up calling a customer service hotline mid-flight. "You have every right to stand up for yourself," Yadira had told her. "If someone abuses their authority, don't stay silent." With trembling hands, Luciana considered rummaging in her bag for her phone. But flight regulations were strict, and mid-flight phone calls were typically prohibited. Another idea sparked in her mind, someone she knew personally who might have the power to do something. But it felt extreme, even borderline impossible. Still, the seeds of determination had been planted. Meanwhile, Helen re-emerged, handing out immigration forms to passengers who weren't American citizens. She gave Luciana a withering glance, her prejudice like a glaring neon sign. Luciana took the paper, her anger coiling tighter. One way or another, she was done enduring this silently. Minutes later, Helen returned, leaning over Luciana's seat as if to demonstrate her authority. "You need to fill that out now," she insisted, pointing to the immigration form. "I'll need to check it when you're done." "It's a domestic flight," Luciana replied, her voice catching. "I'm not sure why you heard me," Helen snapped, drawing the attention of everyone in earshot. "We must verify the status of all passengers." Tom let out a quiet gasp. Another passenger behind them whispered, "She's off her rocker. You don't need that form for domestic flights." Helen shot the whisperer a threatening glare, then turned back to Luciana. "If you're in this country legally, you'll have no problem filling it out." Luciana's heart pounded as she felt the full force of Helen's hateful stare. This wasn't just ignorance, this was targeted aggression. A small child shouldn't have to witness such blatant hostility. Inez clutched at Luciana's sleeve, her large eyes reflecting confusion and fear. Tom murmured, "I can't believe this." His hand itched toward the overhead call button, but Helen stood right there, blocking any possibility of involving another flight attendant. Luciana's fury bubbled, though she kept her voice restrained. She refused to give Helen the satisfaction of seeing her rattle. "I'm an American citizen," she stated calmly, "so there's no reason for me to fill out this form." Helen's lip twitched, as though she couldn't bear the idea of being challenged. "We'll see about that," she hissed. As Helen stomped away, the cabin seemed to breathe again. Tom shook his head, muttering something about calling the airline later. Other passengers looked at Luciana with sympathy, but sympathy alone wouldn't right this wrong. Luciana's hands trembled with an adrenaline rush, the memory of Helen's taunt, "We'll see about that," echoing in her ears. She turned to Tom and whispered, "I've never seen anything like this. I don't know what she might do next." Tom gently patted her shoulder. "If anything else happens, I'll speak up. This is downright harassment." The plane's engines hummed steadily, and the overhead lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants prepared for the in-flight meal service. Luciana noticed that Brooke was handling the back cabin while Helen had claimed the front. Whether that was by design or coincidence, she couldn't be sure. Luciana forced herself to breathe deeply, and in that moment she remembered an important contact in her phone, a connection from her time volunteering for a local political campaign in San Antonio. Through an unexpected series of events, Luciana had once crossed paths with the office of Governor Leticia Cabrera, the governor of Texas, a woman known for her strict stance against discrimination. Though they weren't personal friends, Luciana had once helped gather signatures for the governor's re-election campaign. Could that possibly help now? A flutter of hope ignited in Luciana's chest. Would it be too audacious to try to contact the governor's office from the air? Probably. And yet, as she watched Helen continuing to glare at her from afar, she realized she might not have many other options. This wasn't just a petty inconvenience. The flight attendant's behavior was so openly hostile that Luciana feared it could escalate. Before she could second-guess herself, Luciana discreetly slipped her phone from her purse. The seatbelt sign was still off, and she turned on airplane Wi-Fi, knowing it would allow only limited messaging or emails, certainly no standard phone calls. Her hands shook as she navigated to the governor's office email, typed a quick subject line, "Urgent in-flight harassment," and began to craft a concise but desperate message detailing what was happening. She pressed send, praying it would go through despite the shaky in-flight connection. Moments passed. The email sent indicator took its time spinning. Finally, she received a confirmation. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Would it reach a staffer in time? Possibly not. But the simple act of standing up for herself, of reaching out for help, gave her a sliver of courage she badly needed. Meal service rolled around. Helen pushed a cart toward Luciana's row, her expression as stony as ever. The scent of heated meal trays filled the cabin. Some passengers were already dozing off. Others watched in flight movies with headphones on. Tension or not, life in the sky marched on. Helen stopped at row 6. She handed Tom a tray with minimal fuss. Then she turned to Luciana. "We have 2 options, pasta or chicken. Which do you want?" The question was posed with such pointed coldness that it felt like a trick. Luciana cleared her throat. "Pasta, please. And one for my daughter too." Helen scowled. "She can have yours if you're so hungry." The statement was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. In the background, a faint collective gasp rose from a few passengers. Helen then shoved the pasta tray into Luciana's hands, nearly causing her to drop it on Inez's lap. Tom, outraged, leaned across the seat. "Excuse me, but the child is entitled to her own meal." "She is?" Helen snapped, her voice dripping with false innocence. "Well, maybe next time she can purchase her own ticket instead of..." Luciana's jaw tightened. This was a direct attack on their nationality, their right to even be on that flight. Inez's eyes brimmed with tears. Something snapped inside Luciana, an unbreakable resolution. She wouldn't allow Helen to trample on her dignity any longer. At that moment, a young woman from 2 rows back stood up. She was a short, sharp-featured passenger who introduced herself as Carla. "I heard what you said, and this is ridiculous," Carla called out, her voice thick with indignation. "That child deserves a meal. She's a paying passenger." Helen whirled around, cheeks flushed. "Ma'am, please stay out of this unless you want to be reported for disrupting the flight," she snapped. Carla folded her arms defiantly. "Go ahead and report me. I'd love to speak to your supervisor or the pilot about your behavior." A wave of relief washed over Luciana. She hadn't expected a stranger to come to her defense, especially not so boldly. Emboldened by Carla's defiance, Luciana found her voice too. "Inez deserves her own meal. I paid for 2 tickets. What exactly is the problem here?" Helen's nostrils flared, and she seemed lost for words. At that moment, Brooke emerged from the back of the plane, drawn by the commotion. Sensing a chance to de-escalate, she gently touched Helen's shoulder and turned toward Luciana. "What seems to be the issue, ma'am?" Brooke asked, her tone calm and professional. Luciana inhaled, steadying her voice. "I'd like a meal for my daughter. We ordered 2 tickets, and we expect 2 meals." Brooke looked confused. "Of course. Let me get that for you," she said, shooting Helen a bewildered glance. Luciana suspected that behind Brooke's calm smile lay a million questions about Helen's increasingly bizarre conduct. Brooke soon returned with a meal tray for Inez, and an awkward hush settled over row 6. The tension was thick enough to cut with a butter knife. Helen appeared furious, though she seemed to be restraining herself for now. Carla sat back in her seat, muttering something about power trips. Tom discreetly patted Luciana's arm in solidarity. Luciana tried to distract Inez by asking her about her grandmother in California, whether Inez was excited to see her. Inez nodded, but her usual enthusiasm was dampened by the tense atmosphere. In an effort to lighten her daughter's spirits, Luciana peeled back the foil on the meal tray and pointed out the small desserts. Meanwhile, Helen retreated to the galley, presumably to calm down. The wheels in Luciana's head churned. This flight was far from over. There were still hours to go, and the prospect of continuing under Helen's scrutiny made her stomach twist. But she took solace in Brooke's professional presence and Carla's willingness to stand up for them. Perhaps there was a chance that the rest of the flight would remain uneventful if only Helen's anger didn't ignite again. Behind her calm facade, Luciana still hoped that her email might reach someone in Governor Leticia Cabrera's office. Even a simple phone call from the governor's staff could shift the dynamic entirely, but would it come in time? After the meal service, cabin lights were dimmed to allow passengers to rest. The plane glided through pockets of calm sky. Many passengers succumbed to the lull, dozing off with eye shades and blankets. But Luciana remained wide awake, her mind replaying the events of the day. She remembered her life in San Antonio, the small victories and the countless ways she'd worked to carve out a dignified life for herself and her daughter. She recalled how proud she'd been when she was able to save enough for this trip. Now, that simple dream was marred by Helen's cruelty. Yet, as exhausted as Luciana felt, she also sensed an undercurrent of determination. She refused to let a hateful flight attendant tarnish the special moments she had planned with her mother. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Helen slinking up the aisle, checking overhead bins, quietly conversing with a few passengers. Luciana wondered if Helen was collecting complaints or allies. With a sinking feeling, she realized she could be singled out again at any moment. But before Helen could do any more damage, the overhead intercom crackled to life with an unexpected announcement. If there is a passenger named Luciana Rodriguez on board, please ring your call button. Luciana nearly dropped the blanket she was holding. Passengers around her stirred, curiosity sparking through the dimly lit cabin. Tom looked at her with raised eyebrows. What could this possibly mean? Luciana's heartbeat thundered. A call for her over the PAR system. She pressed her call button, unsure what to expect. Moments later, Brooke appeared, a nervous smile flitting across her face. "Miss Rodriguez?" she asked quietly. "The captain would like to see you up front. There's a phone call for you." An excited flutter soared in Luciana's chest, mingled with confusion. "A phone call? Mid-flight?" She nodded, unbuckled her seatbelt, and glanced at Inez. "I'll be right back," she said softly. Carla leaned forward. "I'll keep an eye on her," Carla offered, and Luciana mouthed a thankful smile. She followed Brooke toward the front of the plane, passing rows of curious passengers. Each step felt heavier, loaded with tension. At the curtain separating the cockpit from the main cabin, Helen stood off to the side, her arms folded, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. Luciana's stomach clenched. She still couldn't shake the ominous feeling that Helen might interfere. Once inside the cockpit area, she found the first officer holding a handset, looking almost as baffled as she felt. "Miss Rodriguez," he said politely, "someone from the governor's office is on the line for you. We received an urgent message through the airline's ground communications." Luciana's eyes widened. It seemed her email had sparked an immediate reaction. She took the handset, her palms sweaty. Was Governor Leticia Cabrera herself on the other end, or just a staffer? Either way, this development was more than she could have imagined. "Hello?" Luciana said tentatively into the handset, her heart pounding loud enough to hear in her ears. A crisp voice answered, identifying herself as Marisol, a senior aide to Governor Leticia Cabrera. "Miss Rodriguez, we received your urgent message. Governor Cabrera takes these matters very seriously. Are you safe at this moment?" Luciana's throat went dry. She cast a glance at the cockpit door, which was closed, offering a sliver of privacy. "I'm as safe as I can be right now," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "It's just, this flight attendant has been harassing me and my daughter. She's made racist remarks, refused services, just an awful situation." Marisol's tone was firm. "Understood. We've already been in contact with Asterion Air's corporate office. They are taking immediate steps to address this situation when your plane lands. The governor is personally appalled by any discrimination, and she wants to assure you that you have her support." Tears pricked the corners of Luciana's eyes. Never in her wildest dreams had she expected such a swift and powerful response. "Thank you," she managed. I I didn't think anyone would even read my email before I landed. Marisol's voice softened. Governor Cabrera is grateful for your courage in speaking out. Please remain calm. We'll be standing by to ensure that appropriate action is taken. Someone from the airline's corporate team or airport officials may meet you at the gate. If you feel threatened, notify the pilot immediately. Luciana hung up, her legs shaky with equal parts relief and astonishment. The first officer offered a respectful nod. We're sorry you've had trouble, ma'am. If there's anything more we can do, please let us know. The captain and I are aware of the situation now. She thanked him quietly, heart fluttering with renewed hope. As she stepped back into the galley area, she met Helen's suspicious gaze. Helen's eyes flickered with confusion and anger. Perhaps she'd caught snippets of the conversation or had been informed by the cockpit crew. Luciana's expression, however, had changed from vulnerable to resolute. This time, she didn't lower her gaze. She looked Helen straight in the eye. Helen opened her mouth, perhaps to utter some retort, but Luciana sidestepped her, not giving the flight attendant the satisfaction of another confrontation. She returned to her seat, mindful of the curious looks from fellow passengers who had witnessed her summons to the front. Tom, Carla, and even Inez perked up when they saw her. "Is everything all right?" Tom asked in a hushed tone. Luciana sank into her seat, exhaling a breath she'd been holding for too long. "I think it will be," she whispered. "That was the governor's office. They're intervening." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the nearby rows. Luciana didn't offer details, but the mere mention of the governor carried an undeniable weight. Slowly, tension began to morph into anticipation. Karmic retribution was on the horizon, even if no one quite knew how it would unfold. As the flight continued, Helen grew increasingly unsettled. She was used to wielding authority in the skies, rarely questioned by passengers or co-workers. Now, rumors spread like wildfire through the cabin that someone high up, someone powerful, had been contacted regarding her behavior. The hush of scandal whispered between seats and across aisles. Luciana could see Helen pacing the length of the plane, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of subordination. At times, she'd stop at random rows, ask if passengers were all right, but the undertone of her questions felt threatening rather than caring. Brooke, on the other hand, seemed to sense the shift in power dynamics. She hovered near row 6 more frequently, checking if Luciana and Inez needed anything else. A beep sounded over the intercom, snapping passengers to attention as the captain's voice filled the cabin. "We'll be beginning our descent into Los Angeles shortly. Local time is 3:15 p.m. Weather is sunny with a gentle breeze. Flight attendants, please prepare for landing." The announcement brought both relief and a spike of anxious excitement for Luciana. She had no idea what waited on the other side of the plane doors, except that the governor's office had put the airline on notice. If Helen thought she could escape accountability, she was sorely mistaken. There was a storm brewing below that tarmac, and Luciana could sense that justice was finally catching up. During the descent, Helen continued her final checks, her demeanor taut as a coiled spring. Row 6 was her final stop. She paused, leveling a glance at Luciana. "Ma'am," she began, "I hope you're aware of the consequences of making false accusations. The airline takes safety and conduct very seriously." Luciana felt Tom stiffen beside her. Inez fidgeted with a loose thread on her seatbelt. This was the moment Luciana had dreaded, a last-ditch effort by Helen to intimidate her into silence. In a steady voice, Luciana replied, "I understand perfectly. I also know it's my right to stand up against discrimination." Helen's nostrils flared. Passengers around them looked on with a sense of charged anticipation. For a second, it seemed as if Helen might say something else, some final parting shot. But instead, she spun around and headed toward the front of the plane without another word. As the plane descended through layers of clouds, The Los Angeles skyline became visible in the distance, a sprawling tapestry of buildings glinting under the California sun. Luciana felt a wave of emotion, relief, fear, hope, and a kind of numb awe. She squeezed Inez's hand. However this concluded, she was determined not to back down. Landing gear lowered, and the plane touched down on the runway with a gentle thump. A ripple of applause rolled through the cabin, a tradition some passengers kept alive whenever they arrived safely. Luciana's stomach fluttered. In minutes, they'd be at the gate, and a resolution loomed. As the plane taxied, Helen remained out of sight, presumably in the galley preparing for disembarkation. Brooke's voice came over the intercom, thanking passengers for choosing Astarian Air. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began gathering their belongings. Luciana took a deep breath. She unbuckled Inez's seatbelt, assisted her with the small backpack containing her coloring books, and motioned for her to stay close. Tom gave her a reassuring nod, and Carla flashed a supportive thumbs up. But just as row 6 was about to file out, a voice boomed from the front. Passengers in rows 1 to 6, please remain seated momentarily. We have a special announcement from the captain. Luciana's heart hammered. She exchanged glances with Tom, both suspecting this had to do with Helen's conduct. Around them, confusion and curiosity flickered through the passengers who weren't in on the events of the flight. The hush was so profound that Luciana could hear her own breathing. The karmic scales were tilting, and they were about to witness the final blow. Helen stood at the front of the cabin, flanked by Brooke and another crew member. Her posture was stiff, eyes downcast. As the captain's voice resonated through the speakers, "We'd like to request that Miss Luciana Rodriguez and her daughter, as well as any passengers who witnessed an incident involving Miss Rodriguez, please remain aboard momentarily. The rest of our passengers may proceed to disembark. Thank you for your cooperation." Passengers around Luciana stirred with wide-eyed surprise. Some mumbled questions. What's going on? Did something happen? But those who had witnessed the tension nodded in understanding. Tom hesitated, then sat back down. Carla also remained, arms folded, determined to see justice served. Luciana's heart pounded. She had wanted accountability, but hadn't expected such a public call-out. Once most of the passengers cleared out, the captain himself emerged from the cockpit, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a serious expression. He made his way down the aisle toward row 6. "Miss Rodriguez?" he inquired politely. Luciana stood, gently guiding Inez to stand beside her. "Yes, sir?" He nodded gravely. "We've been informed of a situation that occurred during this flight. We're going to request statements from you and any other witnesses. We also have ground staff waiting at the jet bridge, along with representatives from Astarian Air and possibly local authorities, should you wish to file a formal complaint." Helen hovered nearby, her face pale, lips pressed together. She hadn't expected to be put under the spotlight so quickly. And from the flicker in her eyes, Luciana guessed Helen finally grasped the severity of her predicament. One by one, Tom, Carla, and even a few other passengers who had overheard Helen's remarks came forward to speak with the captain and a supervisor from Astarian Air who had boarded. Luciana felt both validation and anxiety swirl in her chest. She was grateful that so many people were willing to confirm Helen's abusive behavior. Meanwhile, Helen stood off to the side, occasionally shaking her head or trying to interject. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted at one point. "I was just enforcing regulations." But the testimonies pouring in painted a very different picture. Carla recounted the meal tray incident, Tom detailed. Helen's repeated attempts to demand extra documentation and boarding passes. Another passenger mentioned hearing Helen say, "You people," in a disgusted tone. Each account stacked the evidence higher. Finally, Luciana, with Inez at her side, provided her own statement. She told them about the overhead bin confrontation, the humiliating comments, and how Helen had singled her out throughout the flight. She mentioned that she had notified the governor's office. At the mention of Governor Leticia Cabrera, the airline supervisor's eyes widened. They took notes with even more urgency. Helen's face turned ashen. It was clear that any chance of brushing this under the rug had evaporated. The wheels of accountability were rolling at full speed, and they were aimed squarely at her. After collecting statements, the Asterian Air supervisor took Helen aside. The rest of the group stood in the aisle, awaiting direction. Even without overhearing their conversation, it was evident that Helen was being reprimanded. Her posture remained rigid, but her cheeks flushed with anger and shame. Occasionally, she threw glares at Luciana, as if blaming her for this unraveling. Yet, there was also fear in her eyes, a realization that she had pushed too far. When the supervisor returned, they cleared their throat. "Thank you all for your cooperation. Miss Rodriguez, we deeply apologize for this experience. It is not reflective of Asterian Air's standards. We will be conducting a full investigation. For now, Miss Helen," they paused, choosing words carefully. "Miss Helen will not be part of the disembarkation process. We will arrange a separate debriefing for her. We encourage you to file a formal complaint, and we will provide any assistance necessary." Luciana clenched her jaw, relief mingling with lingering tension. "I will," she said, softly, her voice resolute. She glanced at the flight attendant who had caused her so much grief. Helen stood stiff as a statue, her face betraying turmoil. However, Luciana sensed no pity for her, only the cold satisfaction that justice was at hand. Brooke, offering a gentle smile, guided Luciana, Inez, Tom, and Carla off the plane. As they walked up the jet bridge, Luciana felt the weight of countless eyes on her. But in her heart, she carried the unwavering knowledge that she had done the right thing. Stepping into the terminal, Luciana spotted a small group waiting, a representative from the airline, an airport official, and one other person in a crisp grey suit who introduced himself as Martin, a liaison from Governor Cabrera's local office in Los Angeles. He extended a polite handshake and greeted Luciana warmly. "Miss Rodriguez, the governor sends her regards," Martin began. "She wanted me to let you know we're prepared to assist you with any legal follow-up, if necessary. She apologizes that you had to endure this." Luciana was touched by the support, her eyes threatening to well with tears. "Thank you," she managed. "I never expected this much help." Martin's expression was kind. "Governor Cabrera has always been vocal against discrimination. She admires your courage in speaking out." The airline representative cleared his throat nervously. "We're truly sorry about this ordeal. We'd like to offer compensation and ensure that the flight attendant faces the proper consequences. We'll be contacting you soon." While part of Luciana wanted to lash out at the airline for employing someone like Helen, she also recognized the sincerity in their efforts to make amends. She nodded, swallowing the raw emotions swirling inside. Inez clung to her hand, looking around at the busy terminal, the overhead signs directing travelers to baggage claim or connecting gates. For Luciana, the grim memory of that flight would linger, but so would a new sense of empowerment she had refused to be silenced. Luciana, Inez, Tom, and Carla collected their luggage together, forging an unexpected bond over the tumultuous flight. Tom insisted on walking Luciana to the rideshare station, wanting to ensure she got off safely. Carla handed Luciana a slip of paper with her phone number. "In case you need my statement," she said, "or if you just need someone to talk to." Luciana thanked them both. As the automatic doors slid open, warm California air greeted them. It felt like liberation, an embrace from the city that would soon house a much happier reunion with her mother. Inez's eyes lit up at the sight of palm trees swaying near the arrivals area. Over the next few days, Luciana would learn that Helen had been suspended from duty pending a formal investigation. With multiple witness statements and the governor's office pushing for strict accountability, it was likely that Helen's career with Attendant had reached its end. Word of the incident spread quickly through social media and local news outlets, further solidifying the airline's resolve to address the matter publicly. Yet for Luciana, her daughter, and even those who had come to her defense, the story was ultimately about standing up for justice. And in that, a quiet karmic retribution found its mark. Helen, once so smug and untouchable, had been brought face to face with consequences she never imagined, undone by her own prejudice in the presence of a mother who refused to be broken. 3 days after the flight, Luciana received a personal call from Governor Leticia Cabrera's press secretary. They informed her that Governor Cabrera was profoundly disturbed by Helen's actions and was drafting a statement denouncing racism in customer service environments. The governor also expressed interest in meeting Luciana during her next visit to San Antonio. Luciana was stunned. She, a humble mother and waitress, had her voice carried all the way to the highest office in Texas. Sitting in her mother's cozy Los Angeles apartment, Luciana reflected on how quickly life could change. Days ago, she had just been another weary traveler, hoping for a smooth flight. She never anticipated becoming the focal point of a discrimination case that captured statewide attention. But she had done what she believed was right, even in the face of hostility. And she felt empowered in a way she never had before. Inez was nestled by her grandmother, eagerly chatting about the scary plane ride that ended with new friends and a sense of triumph. Luciana smiled, a peace settling over her. Helen's hateful treatment had only strengthened Luciana's resolve to advocate for herself and her daughter. If there was a silver lining, it was this: courage born of adversity, a testament that silence in the face of injustice was never the only option. Days turned into a week, and Luciana's phone buzzed intermittently with calls from news outlets, online blogs, and even a local TV station wanting her story. Each time, Luciana remembered the fear she'd felt on that plane, the shame of being singled out, the frustration of feeling powerless. Yet she also remembered the moment she realized she wasn't alone, when Carla and Tom spoke up, and when the governor's office reached out. Their voices had amplified her own, turning a personal humiliation into a public stand for dignity. Helen, on the other hand, had vanished from the airline's roster. Rumor had it she was let go, but the airline refused to give details. Luciana suspected that was the best outcome for everyone. Occasionally, she found herself wondering if Helen felt any remorse, or if she simply harbored resentment at being held accountable. In truth, it no longer mattered. Luciana had found closure in the knowledge that justice was served. As Luciana packed her bags to return home to Texas, she took one last look around her mother's apartment. This trip was meant to be a simple family reunion, but it had become so much more, a reminder that standing up for one's rights could be life-changing. She glanced at Inez, who was already half asleep on the sofa, dreaming peacefully. Luciana knew that from this day forward, she would teach her daughter that no form of discrimination was worth enduring in silence. On the flight back to San Antonio, ironically, again with Attendant, Luciana was met with a starkly different reception. The crew, informed by the airline of her prior experience, bent over backward to ensure she and Inez were treated with kindness. The flight's lead attendant even offered an upgrade to a more spacious seat, which Luciana politely declined. She wasn't looking for special favors, just fairness. During the flight, she reflected on the viral nature of her story. It had popped up on social media, with hashtags like #NoRoomForRacism trending for a few days. She had received messages of support from strangers around the world, many of whom shared similar experiences. Some wrote to thank her for speaking out, saying her courage gave them hope that people could make a difference by standing up for each other. In her window seat, Luciana gazed at the vast expanse of clouds below, marveling at how a single act of prejudice could set off a chain reaction of events, one that had ended in a surprising and strangely beautiful kind of justice. As the plane began its descent into San Antonio, she felt ready to return to her daily life, content in the knowledge that she had not only survived, but also emerged stronger for it. Upon landing, Luciana was greeted by a small, welcoming committee friends from her neighborhood, local supporters who had followed her story. They clapped as she and Inez came through the gate, making Luciana's cheeks burn with equal parts pride and embarrassment. News cameras flashed, and a reporter asked for a quick comment. Luciana was momentarily overwhelmed by the attention. She looked at Inez, who grinned widely, enjoying the applause. Gathering her composure, Luciana spoke into the microphone. "I never wanted fame or publicity. I just wanted to be treated as a human being. I hope that what happened encourages others to stand up against hate. No one should fear taking a flight or walking into a store because of who they are." Applause broke out again. Standing off to the side, she saw someone she recognized immediately, Marisol, the aide to Governor Cabrera, who had spoken to her over the phone. Marisol waved, a proud smile on her face. Luciana approached her, and the two embraced briefly, as though they were old friends rather than strangers united by a crisis. "Your courage has made a difference," Marisol whispered, pressing a business card into Luciana's hand. "The governor wants you to know her office is always open if you need anything." That evening, in the quiet sanctuary of her own apartment, Luciana finally had time to breathe. Inez lay asleep, tuckered out from the excitement of the day. Luciana scrolled through her phone, reading messages of solidarity from people across the country. She felt gratitude, a blossoming warmth that overshadowed the lingering bitterness of Helen's harassment. Yes, there had been fear. Yes, there had been anger. But there had also been an outpouring of empathy that shone a light on the better side of humanity. In an odd way, Helen's cruelty had sparked a wave of kindness, proving that one hateful act could be drowned out by many voices of support. The next morning, she took Inez to her favorite playground, letting her run free under the golden Texan sun. Another mother approached, asked if she was the brave lady from the plane, and thanked her for refusing to tolerate discrimination. Luciana felt a humble pride she had done something she never thought she would do. She'd taken a personal stand and turned it into a message that resonated far beyond her own life. As Inez giggled on the swings, Luciana closed her eyes and breathed in the sweet air of home. This was her life, imperfect, challenging, but filled with small wonders. And she wouldn't trade it for anything. Weeks later, Luciana received a formal letter from Asterion Air, detailing the outcome of their internal investigation. It confirmed that Helen had been terminated. The airline extended an official apology, acknowledging that no passenger should ever be made to feel unwelcome. They also offered vouchers for future flights, though Luciana wasn't sure she'd want to fly so soon again. What mattered most, the letter stated, was that they recognized the harm done and were committed to retraining their staff on anti-discrimination policies. While Luciana was still uneasy about stepping onto another plane, she appreciated the gesture. Perhaps some good had come from her ordeal, not just for her, but for countless other passengers who might otherwise face a similar injustice. She read the letter aloud to Inez, simplifying the language so her daughter could grasp the essence, that the lady who was mean to them wouldn't be working there anymore, and that the airline promised to do better. Inez nodded, her innocence shining through. "Good," she said, then asked if they could visit Grandma again soon. Luciana smiled. "Yes, mi amor. "We will," she promised, realizing that next time she could board a plane with a little more confidence, knowing that one person's bravery really could change the world. The day finally arrived when Luciana found herself in an unexpected place, Governor Leticia Cabrera's office in San Antonio. She had been invited to a small roundtable discussion on combating discrimination in the service industry. Nervous but determined, Luciana entered the conference room, holding Inez's hand tightly. Governor Cabrera, a tall, poised woman with a commanding presence, greeted them personally. "Luciana," she said warmly, "thank you for coming. I've heard a lot about your courage." Luciana blushed, trying to find the right words. "Governor, you have no idea how much your support meant to me." "I just did what I had to do." The governor nodded, her expression earnest. Sometimes that's all it takes, doing what we have to do, and refusing to be silent. That's where real change begins. Luciana and Inez took a seat at the table among community leaders, activists, and representatives from various organizations. They discussed strategies for preventing incidents like the one on the plane training programs, stricter oversight, clear lines of accountability. Luciana shared her experience, explaining what went through her mind when Helen's comments first pierced her dignity. By the end of the meeting, she felt lighter, as if she'd turned her trauma into a stepping stone for progress. After the roundtable, Governor Cabrera took Luciana aside. In a private moment, she thanked her again. "We need more people like you, not afraid to speak out, especially when it's hardest," the governor said, offering a small token, a commemorative pin emblazoned with the Texas state seal. "Wear this knowing you stood for what's right." Luciana accepted the pin with trembling hands, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. She never imagined she'd be recognized by a governor for something as basic as defending her civil rights. Yet there she stood, a waitress from San Antonio, being honored in a state office for her courage. On the drive home, Luciana couldn't stop smiling. She looked at Inez, who was snoozing in her booster seat, and wondered what memories her daughter would retain from all of this. Hopefully, she'd remember not the fear, but the bravery and the knowledge that one's voice, no matter how small, could spark a powerful ripple of change. From that day forward, Luciana wore the pin on her apron at work, a silent reminder of her own self-worth, and a testament to the possibility that even the most ordinary people could call upon extraordinary allies when standing against injustice. Life gradually returned to normal for Luciana and Inez. The media buzz around their incident subsided, replaced by newer stories. Yet in their small community, people remembered. Neighbors greeted Luciana with smiles, telling her they admired what she'd done. A local Spanish radio station invited her to speak about her ordeal, giving hope to other Latina mothers who faced discrimination daily. One afternoon, Luciana sat at her kitchen table, flipping through photos from the trip to Los Angeles. She paused at a snapshot of Inez and her grandmother hugging by the beach, happy, unburdened, free. She realized that despite the terror in the skies, the trip had been a net gain. They had discovered not only family joy, but also personal strength. She also reflected on the flight's final twist, a racist flight attendant frozen in panic when Luciana called upon the governor's office. It still felt surreal, like a scene from a dramatic movie. How quickly Helen had retreated once she saw real accountability barreling her way. Karmic retribution had arrived swiftly indeed. With a quiet chuckle, Luciana closed the photo album. She pressed a hand to her heart, thinking, "We are stronger than we know." For the rest of her days, she would carry this truth like a bright, unwavering light. On a breezy Sunday evening, Luciana took Inez to the local park. They strolled along a gravel path, the setting sun casting long shadows over the playground. In the distance, a group of children played soccer, their laughter mingling with the rustling of leaves. This was the type of moment Luciana lived for, simple, peaceful, untainted by the prejudice that had once threatened to overshadow her life. She heard her phone ping. A text message from Carla. "Hey, just checking in. Hope you're well. I saw an article about the governor praising you for standing up against racism. Proud to call you my friend." Luciana smiled, remembering the woman's fierce support on that flight. She replied, "Thank you, amiga. Let's catch up soon." Then she looked at Inez scaling the monkey bars, her small face bright with concentration and determination qualities. Luciana wished to nurture, ensuring her daughter would never shy away from defending her own dignity. The world could be harsh, but it could also be filled with allies and protectors, just like Tom, Carla, Brooke, and even the governor. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Luciana exhaled a contented sigh. She had confronted her greatest fears at 30,000 feet and emerged victorious. Sometimes, she mused, the darkest storms paved the way for the brightest dawns. Thank you for joining us on this intense and uplifting journey that soared above the clouds before diving into the depths of injustice and back again. Luciana's story reminds us that courage can flourish in the most daunting circumstances, and that a single voice, backed by the truth, can rally a community, even drawing the attention of powerful allies. In the face of discrimination, she discovered not only her own resilience, but the profound kindness of strangers determined to stand alongside her. If this tale moved you, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support enables more stories that champion hope, justice, and the indomitable human spirit. Let's keep inspiring each other together.